Foundation and Museum and Libraries websites. Tonight's program is available by Zoom and Facebook. We are monitoring both of these sites for questions for a Q&A with the authors at the end of the program. Our next virtual program will be on November 17th with Harvard professor Frederick. He will be discussing his book, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. Please watch your emails and mailboxes for details on viewing that event. Our programming is possible with the support of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, members of the Friends of Ford, and the National Archives and Records Administration. Join me in welcoming Peter Baker and Susan Glasser as they explore the life and times of James A. Baker III, a retired trustee of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the subject of their new book. A previous winner of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency, Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, a political analyst for MSNBC, and the author of Days of Fire and The Breach. Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of its weekly letter from Trump's Washington, as well as a CNN Global Affairs analyst. Their first assignment as a married couple was as Moscow bureau chiefs for the Washington Post, after which they wrote Kremlin Rising. Joel Westfall, deputy director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, will be moderating tonight's event. Susan, Peter, and Joel, welcome.
Thank you, Brooke. And thank you, Peter and Susan, for agreeing to do this book talk about a fantastic and amazing figure in American political history. How we will run tonight's program is I have a set list of questions which I have prepared myself. And following that, we will get to the Q&A portion. If you have questions for Peter and Susan, please place them in the Q&A chat, and we will get to those shortly. So my first question, having read the book, Jim Baker's father, he really never wanted him involved in politics. In fact, he was in his late 30s when he actually began involved in politics. How did he eventually find his way into the political realm and so late in life?
Well, thank you so much, Joel, because I think the answer is very relevant to why we're having this conversation with you and the Ford Library and the Ford Foundation today, because in fact, Jim Baker is a product of the Ford administration. And really, if it weren't for, this sort of accident of timing in his own life that made him ready and interested to get into politics, which is something that his own family, by the way, was very much against. He was a fourth generation Texan. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all been, very prominent lawyers, but also really builders of the city of Houston. And they had one family rule, and that was work hard, study hard, and stay out of politics. And it was a very privileged, but also a very constraining world in many ways that Baker came from. And so in a way, it was sort of an act of rebellion and also a family tragedy, the death of his first wife at a young age, that led him to be interested in politics. His best friend was George Herbert Walker Bush. But if it weren't for the Ford administration, none of this would have happened. Really, Watergate wiped out an entire generation, in effect, of Republican Party operatives. And so by the time Baker in his life was ready to make a kind of change like this, he was literally able to go from a relatively obscure posting in President Ford's administration at the Commerce Department, which I can tell you, being here in Washington, was not the center of the action then or ever since. And yet somehow he parlayed that within 1 year, he rose to become President Ford's running his campaign.
So you mentioned Ford, and because we are at the Ford Presidential Library Museum, I'm going to answer a Ford-centric question. I love in your book, of course, one of the chapters is called The Miracle Man. And he was called the Miracle Man because of his running of the Gerald Ford campaign, which he held off a major attack from the far right and Ronald Reagan. and then ran the 1976 campaign election. And then he kind of made it look like even though Ford lost, Baker came out of it as a big winning figure. What led to that perception, and why did he come out of that loss of that presidential campaign looking like a winner?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And to repeat what Susan said, we're very grateful to the Ford Foundation Library for hosting us. I've had the honor of being out there a couple times to talk in the past. It's more fun in person, but we're grateful to everybody for doing it on Zoom. Yeah, Baker, again, was sort of an accidental miracle man, using that title. That was the title that he was given at the 1976 convention, the sort of code name that they used for their walkie-talkies. They called him Miracle Man. Later got picked up by the New York Times in a headline. But he came so close to not having that happen. He only got there because while Undersecretary of Commerce, he had impressed Raj Morton, who was the Secretary of Commerce, who had become Ford's campaign chairman. And when Jack Stiles, who was, of course, Ford's original campaign manager back in Grand Rapids when he ran for Congress, who was supposed to be the delegate hunter for the 76 convention, died tragically in a car accident, it's Raj Morton who says, hey, you should bring this kid Baker up, not so much a kid, he was 45. You should bring this young guy Baker up to be Jack Stiles' replacement. He does such a good job at the convention of, as you say, of holding off Reagan, even though that was a really dicey moment, that when Raj Morton is sort of eased aside as the campaign chairman, the next logical person then was Baker. So suddenly, boom, 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 he's in this position of extraordinary authority. And you're right, he doesn't win that campaign. So how does he come out ahead? Well, they had entered the convention 33 points down to Jimmy Carter. And by the end of the campaign had come to a hair's breadth away. If only 9,000 voters had switched their position in Hawaii and Ohio, Gerald Ford would have won the Electoral College and been elected on his own right in 1976. So it came so far back. I think that Baker, really impressed people, even though the final result was not a victory.
One other fact I found interesting, again, early on in the book, is it's 1980. He is running the campaign for Herbert Walker Bush in the Republican primary. Of course, Bush 41 loses that campaign to Reagan, yet somehow James Baker ends up as Reagan's chief of staff. I mean, was this pure political maneuvering on Baker's part, or was it something else?
That again is, when you look at this career, you are continually kind of amazed by these things that shouldn't by all rights happen, but that somehow managed to happen with him. And once again, it's this combination of, luck and skill and timing and impressing the right people at the right moment. Imagine today, and you really can't imagine, somebody who ran not one, but two national campaigns, against Donald Trump, becoming his chief of staff, right? Like, it's obviously inconceivable. And Baker had run not only the Ford effort against Reagan in the 1976 primaries, but in 1980, his best friend was running for president. And of course, he was the campaign manager. Baker had impressed the Reagan camp back in 1976. And Reagan actually came and did a fundraiser for Baker in his one and only effort at elective office, which was a failed 1978 race for Texas Attorney General. In a way, it's a good thing he lost that, because he probably never would have gone on to become White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of State had he won that. But Reagan, so there were ties between them after his debut in national politics. But in 1980, Bush ran and became actually Reagan's principal challenger in the Republican primaries. And, once again, was sort of seen as the kind of occupying that Ford lane, the establishment Republican. And it started out really from nowhere. So Baker was seen as having run an excellent race, once again, taking a candidate from literally being an asterisk in the polls to essentially consolidating the opposition to Reagan in the primaries. And yet Baker was very strategic. He was actually focused not so much on getting this chief of staff job for himself, but he was very focused actually on getting his friend George Bush onto the ticket as Reagan's vice president. And somehow he managed to do both things, which is remarkable. But, the book has an interesting story, the backstory of how he got that chief of staff job. And basically it involves the sort of intrigue among Reagan's existing inner circle, which was a very faction-ridden, intrigue-filled group. And, Peter can tell the story of that, but I think it's a story as much about the Reagan world as it is about Baker trying to get the job.
This is the Ed Meese story.
Yeah. Well, that's how he got pushed out. But it actually was Stuart Spencer and Michael Deaver who were intriguing to basically push Meese aside and to get Baker in. And this was even before the election, interestingly. They conspired to put Baker on Reagan's campaign plane and to give him some valuable face time in front of the candidate.
As a historian, oftentimes I'm a little intrigued with kind of what ifs. And one of the ones that I kind of pointed at in the book was this issue of Jim Baker becoming the national security advisor. That it is quite probably, and I think you argue about this in your book, that Iran-Contra might not have occurred. And even, of course, Reagan himself stated, and I'll quote a passage in your book, my decision not to appoint Jim Baker as the national security advisor, I suppose, was a turning point for my administration. And after all that, I mean, how did Jim Baker end up as the Treasury Secretary rather than the head of the National Security Advice?
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things I think we love the most about doing this book are these kind of what if moments, like how the hinges of history change and turn, not just because of big forces of history, which of course obviously are super meaningful, but because Jim Baker met somebody on the tennis court in the Houston Country Club, and that happened to be George H.W. Bush, right? And suddenly his life would take a different turn if he hadn't. Or in this case, he is tired of being chief of staff. It's an exhausting job, so he decides to kind of maneuver to become national security advisor, convinces Reagan of it. Reagan's got the press release ready to announce. But first, he's got a meeting in the Situation Room with the national security team. And Baker makes one of his rare mistakes. He doesn't go with the president to the meeting. Well, at the meeting are all his enemies, all of Baker's enemies. And they discover what's about to happen. And they pile on Reagan and say, you can't do it. You can't do it. He's the biggest leaker in Washington. He doesn't know anything about national security. You can't do it. Baker comes up and says, Reagan comes up to Baker and Deaver says, sorry, fellas, I can't go through with it. And you're right. Reagan later comes to regret it because Baker was so skeptical of the whole adventurism in Central America. There's almost no question he would have put a kibosh on this Iran-Contra scheme if he had known about it, and he would have run a tighter ship, presumably, than his successors. But McFarlane, John Poindexter end up going along with this scheme. They're the next two national security advisors, and Baker, by this point, is in the Treasury Department, doesn't know anything about it. But you're right. So how does he become Treasury Secretary is another funny story. He's trying to mollify Don Regan, who at that point is the Treasury Secretary, who's mad about a leak in the paper. Baker comes over to his office and says, look, you don't really want to resign. No, it's not a big deal. And Don Regan calms down. And Baker kind of slides in his chair. And he's all exhausted. And Regan says, you look really, beat up and tired. He says, I really am. This is after the '84 election. And Regan says, well, I got an idea. Why don't we just swap jobs? Because Regan actually understood that the real power in an administration was being White House chief of staff, if done well, the way Baker did it. And Baker, for them, this is like the escape route. This is like Charlie in the Willy Wonka factory getting the golden ticket to the chocolate factory. Okay.
Sorry,
anyway,
no sale on that one.
All right, this is his escape route. He wanted to get out, and he would be joining the cabinet. He would be a principal and no longer just a staff guy. So he jumps on the chance. Reagan loves it too. The two of them swap jobs. Reagan goes along with it. And as you say, history is made because of that.
Although interestingly, there's really still some resentment among the, kind of Reagan inner circle at the idea that, Baker knew somehow that Reagan would be a terrible chief of staff. They blamed Reagan ultimately for, the mishandling of Iran-Contra and the sort of debacles of the early part of Reagan's second term. And, there was a sense that, that Baker kind of got out while the getting was good, while perhaps knowing that he wasn't best serving the boss. But, I do think that, as Peter said, he was seizing his opportunity to leave one of the most grueling jobs in Washington. And remarkably, by the way, he turned out to be quite a good Treasury Secretary. He had no background at all and no preparation at all to be Treasury Secretary. He had an undergraduate economics course at Princeton, which, by the way, he did not do all that well in. no finance background, nothing. And it's really quite a remarkable story about what he was able to get done given all that.
So I didn't have this question prepared, but Peter, you mentioned it, so I'm gonna go into this. And that was your comment about the leaking. Now, when you read this book, wow, I mean, you really get an understanding. Like, if you think today there's leaking today, when you go and read this book, I mean, I think James Baker had to have been the king leaker throughout the time when he was chief of staff. He really used a lot of it to his advantage. And even if I recall, in one time, he nearly got in really trouble for it, where the president, Ronald Reagan, threatened everybody either in the cabinet or who was in a meeting to be to go on and have a lie detector test.
Yeah, that's right. He's right. Exactly right. Now, he was a leaker. Now, he would say differently. He would say, well, I wasn't leaking, I was backgrounding. Background, of course, being the way you talk to reporters when you don't want your name attached to it. And his argument would be that his leaking or backgrounding was in the service of the president in order to feed reporters and keep them more or less happy. And there's something to that, by the way. He spent a lot of time on the care and feeding of reporters. And speaking of reporters, I think we generally approve of that. Yeah, we support that. Every Friday he would have the news magazine reporters into his office, and he'd give them this behind the scene tidbits that they love for those stories. And around 6 o'clock, if Sam Donaldson called the office saying, "What's the latest?" Baker would have something fresh to give him right before he went on the air. So he really understood how the media worked. Back in those days, if you had a bad story, you would bury it by announcing it Friday night. If you had a good story that you wanted to float, you would leak it out for the Monday morning paper. And he knew all these tricks.
Did he start that? I'm curious. Did he start that principle?
I don't think he started. I think he mastered it, right? I think that he was just sort of like really adept at it. Larry Speakes, who was effectively the press secretary during Reagan, said that he thought that Baker spent 50% of his time dealing with the media. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but it tells you how much he really did spend on that. In fact, he made a point of always returning every reporter's call before he went home for the night. Now, this is in the days that they didn't have texts and they didn't have emails. And so he knew if he returned it at 8 o'clock at night, the reporter probably wouldn't be there, but he still made that effort. And I think that did him well with a lot of reporters. Did he leak about his enemies and his adversaries like Ed Meese? Of course he did. That's the way things worked back then. It was a very tough White House. In fact, I got an email or text actually from a Trump White House guy who's reading the book. He says, "Boy, I tell you, I thought our White House was full of intrigue and backstabbing and palace intrigue. The only difference is that Baker was competent."
Well, the other important difference was that he actually had a rule going back to that 1976 campaign, don't lie to reporters.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the reasons for why he was so well regarded by the press corps was because he more or less abided by that rule. And he had seen back in 1976 that it gave him enormous credibility with the national political reporter. John Sears, Reagan's campaign manager, was a big puff artist, basically. And he kept saying, giving inflated counts of how Reagan was doing in the convention fight for delegates, and they turned out not to hold up. And Baker sort of took the opposite course. And even when it wasn't as advantageous to Ford, he would tell it more or less like it was. And he carried away from that experience the idea that, credibility is the currency of the realm in Washington. And certainly when he then rose to be Reagan's chief of staff and in the cabinet, he was an aggressive spin guy, perhaps. He was aggressive at, putting out their point of view. But the reason that he was also, I think, so well regarded by the press was because he didn't lie to them. Yeah. And unfortunately, that's not something, obviously, that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, the non-lying, the truth speaker really comes out across in the book quite well. Just so everybody knows, again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Right now we've got a couple, and if you have any more out there, please submit them. I'm going to ask 2 more and then move to our patrons and our clients questions. So let's skip ahead to 1988, and Baker is now running the Bush 41 campaign, and my question is please discuss his role in one of the most infamous presidential campaign commercials in American history, the Willie Horton commercial.
Right, exactly. Well, first of all, one thing you need to know about Jim Baker is he was a knife fighter when it came to elections. He was ruthless when he needed to be. He was not a softball. Ask Michael Dukakis or Al Gore or any of the others who faced him. The difference was when the election was over, then he would sit down with Democrats and go to work. But specifically about that campaign, I think you're right. That was sort of a precursor of a lot of the politics we would see in the years to come in future cycles. Willie Horton, of course, had been released under the Massachusetts furlough program, went on to rape and brutalize a woman in Maryland and her boyfriend. And he became the symbol that the Bush campaign used, by the way, after Al Gore first used him in the primaries, to paint Michael Dukakis' weak on crime. Now, the famous commercial that you're referring to, and people will remember, was not actually produced by the Bush campaign itself. It featured Willie Horton's face, and a lot of people said it was racist because it seemed to be suggesting, here's this scary black man, he's going to come and invade your house if Michael Dukakis becomes president. Well, that ad was produced by an independent organization, pro-Bush, pro-Republican, but not technically the campaign. Now, what Baker would say, I didn't do that ad. Our ad didn't use Willie Horton's name, didn't use his face, that they showed prisoners coming in and out of a turnstile, all of them except for one were white, and that they say that they weren't race baiting. But they didn't mind that Willie Horton was out there. In fact, Lee Atwater said, I'm going to make that Willie Horton to be Michael Dukakis' running mate when it's all over. So they were trying to exploit Willie Horton too. They just didn't happen to use that ad, which was pretty brazen, I think. And when we asked Baker about that years later, he allowed that perhaps that ad was, over the top and too far, maybe something of a regret of his. But then he kind of backs off and says, well, look, overall, I think that campaign we did the right thing and we had to win. We went after the issues that were in front of us. And so I think that tells you a lot about, campaigning in that era.
Well, and the whole point was, if it wasn't Willie Horton, it would have been something else in that campaign, because Baker, is a very, very clear-eyed realist when it comes to assessing any situation in front of him, whether it was a, foreign policy situation or a political campaign. And the truth is that Michael Dukakis was killing George H.W. Bush. And they came out of the convention with a 17-point deficit in the polls. And Baker was actually just coming into the campaign from being Treasury Secretary. In those days, campaigns didn't last forever, unlike today. And he looked at it and he very ruthlessly understood that there was really actually no way to come from behind. Americans were actually sick and tired of Republicans after 2 terms of Reagan. Generally speaking, in our history, that would have been a time for a Democratic president to win. And the only way for Bush to win was to run a very ruthlessly negative campaign, and they succeeded in that. So it wasn't just Willie Horton. Michael Dukakis was sort of a mild-mannered Massachusetts technocrat, and they turned him into, a sort of like wild-eyed, crazy leftist liberal who was against the Pledge of Allegiance, who was, against, God and country, essentially. And the Willie Horton thing really fit very squarely within that campaign. And so he was against the flag. That was another thing. They literally wrapped the president in the flag for that campaign. So, I think.
And he made immediate use of the issue with the M1 tank, him driving around in the M1 tank with the helmet on.
Well, that was a big mistake on Dukakis' part, and that was right there in Michigan, right?
Yes, it was. My last question before we get to the patron's question is, in the book, actually early on in the book, there is a comment about Jim Baker, and I'm quoting Tom Donnellan here, who was President Obama's national security advisor. He stated that Baker was the most important unelected official since World War II. So with that phrase, with that in mind, how does James Baker III compare with others like him who were also never elected? Folks like Kissinger, John Foster Dulles, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice.
Right. That's a good question, I think. And I think you look at Kissinger, and obviously he's sort of an iconic figure as a Secretary of State. But Kissinger didn't run 5 presidential campaigns, right? And he wasn't a chief of staff, and he wasn't Treasury Secretary. He had one thing. He did it, obviously very prominently and very consequentially, and that was and that made him important in history. But Baker did politics and policy. It's like Karl Rove and Kissinger rolled into one, right? Imagine running 5 presidential campaigns. All 4 Republican presidents, from the end of Watergate to the early 2000s, at some point or another depended on Jim Baker to help them run the country, run their campaigns, or run the world. He had been Secretary of State when the Cold War ended, when Germany was reunified, when we fought the first Gulf War successfully. And I think that therefore Baker's role in almost every major thing that happens from the 76 convention, right, all the way through the 2006 Iraq Study Group, he has his finger in almost everything. In some form or another, he is, this consequential figure. You may not like him, you may disagree with him, but he is a part of every major, action for a generation. And that's why this book is important from our point of view, because it's a study in power and how power works. And he is sort of an exemplar of that.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that. We're going to get to our first question here, and our first question actually comes from, I'm not going to say who it is, a Ford Presidential Library and Museum trustee.
Right.
And the question is, tell us about Baker's close, confident role with Nancy Reagan during the Reagan presidency.
It's an excellent question because, as I said, Baker was a ruthless analyzer and understander of the world as it is, not the world as he would want it to be. And of course, as an astute student of power, he understood who really had it, and that was Nancy Reagan. And so he knew that she played a crucial role, not only with President Reagan himself, but in that White House. And he early on made her an ally and an advocate, including often at times she was even a back channel. And sometimes that involved him, by the way, conveniently ignoring things. For example, he knew about the consultations with the astrologer that the First Lady was undertaking, but did not even pass along that information to his own closest confidants. So he was delicate and not, sort of upsetting that apple cart. And of course, his successor as chief of staff, one of the things he did to run afoul in the Reagan White House was to take on Mrs. Reagan. And Baker was just much too smooth of an operator early on. It's interesting because Mrs. Reagan, like Barbara Bush, like other political spouses, right, has often been described as a sort of caring about loyalty and making sure that people were there, for her Ronnie. But yet Baker was an interloper to this inner circle, right? He was a newcomer. He came from the Bush world, but something about him really impressed Nancy Reagan. And I think she thought he looked the part. He went out of his way to court her, but he very quickly integrated himself with her. And I think she was a key ally. And by the way, when she passed away, it's notable that it was Jim Baker who was asked and did give the eulogy at her funeral a couple of years ago. I guess it's 4 years ago now.
The latter half of the book pays attention to his role as Secretary of State. And this question comes from Paul. What was Jim Baker's biggest accomplishment as Secretary of State?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that I think that the peaceful end of the Cold War has to rank right up there with one of the most extraordinary moments in our modern history, right? Now, did Jim Baker or George H.W. Bush or even Ronald Reagan end the Cold War? No. Did they make the Soviet Union fall apart? No. Did they bring down the Berlin Wall? No. Those were actions taken by Russians, by Germans, and so forth. But it's Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush in that period who take these forces of history that are washing through Europe at that time, and they try to harness them. And they try to direct them to a safe and peaceful landing. And I think that you could look at the reunification of Germany as a case study and how he made diplomacy work. The Germans wanted to reunify, but it wasn't a given that was going to happen. The Soviets had 300,000 troops in East Germany. They could have stopped it with a snap of the fingers if they wanted to. And it wasn't just the Soviets who were against it. It was our allies. It was the British, Margaret Thatcher. It was the French and Francois Mitterrand. They had fought 2 wars against Germany. They didn't want to reunify Germany on their border. And then you had the Germans themselves, not just the East Germans versus the West Germans. You had the West Germans versus the West Germans because their own government was fragmented into this coalition. And Baker took all of these moving parts and helped find a way to create a formula that within just 1 year of the fall of the wall brought the 2 Germanys together again, which was in remarkable time, just 30 years ago this past weekend, I think it was. And if you think about what could have happened, had they delayed a little bit, the Iraq invasion of Kuwait might have happened, the Soviet coup against Gorbachev might have happened, and that would have completely bollocked things up completely. So I think that you could look at that as a case study in where individuals and diplomacy actually do matter, even amid the larger forces of history.
I like this next question, and because again, after reading the book, it kind of takes me down memory lane. There's a lot of reminiscing about the times in Washington where there was bipartisanship, and people often came to the table to make deals. The question comes from Christy. Currently, there is quite a bit of tension between political parties. Do you think we can move back to a more bipartisan Washington, which you really do quite a fantastic job about illustrating in the book?
You know, I think, Christy, that's a great question, because you know, how much of this is a structural shift in our politics, right? Like, that's really the question. And the answer is a lot of it, right? So the incentives are really different than they were in Baker's time. And by the way, Baker was a big, super competitive guy, and the path to winning politics in those days actually did go through accomplishment, right? So he had a huge incentive to make those deals, A, because he thought they were the right thing to do, but B, because that also was the recipe for political success. In a world where you're trying to get the biggest possible coalition to vote for you, you know, that makes sense, right? It also was a political reality. There was divided government through most of Reagan's tenure, through all of Bush's tenure. He had to go through the Democrats in the House of Representatives, because that was the only power that mattered in the House of Representatives the entire time Reagan and Bush were in office, right? So that structural incentive has changed. And of course, the nature of how our politics is conducted has changed. Permanent campaigning, aiming to the base. Our media has fragmented in a way such that you can narrowcast to a small segment of people and rely upon them to turn out. People talk about this as, you know, essentially giving up on persuading the massive voters and simply mobilizing the ones who are already on your side. So Baker was operating in a very different political environment. However, I would like to caveat and say he also truly is a natural deal maker, and he's much more skilled at it than, you know, many of the, you know, sort of so-called practitioners of it today. And I got to think that even in today's gridlock, sclerotic, dysfunctional Washington, look at the COVID relief package that has been sitting in front of Congress, and nothing has happened since April for the American people, with millions of people out of jobs, with, you know, 210,000 plus dead in the pandemic. I have to say that I find it hard to imagine that Jim Baker wouldn't have found a way to get a relief package in front of the American people.
Next question comes from Sean, and that is, what was Baker's role in helping Reagan deal with the Iran-Contra crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. His role was to keep 100 feet away from it, basically. You know, he wanted nothing to do with it. Now, he did. There's a great memo in the book about a meeting that is held without Baker, actually, in which his name is invoked, in which everybody says, well, Baker says it would be illegal and possibly impeachable if we do what we're talking about doing. And some of the advocates say, you know, Baker doesn't know what he's talking about. And so rather than listening to Baker's own advice, they plow forward and go even further than Baker knew that they ever went. When Baker discovers as Treasury Secretary that all this has been going on, it all begins to break out in public. He runs into John Poindexter, who was a national security advisor, of course, one of the architects of the whole scheme. And Poindexter says to Baker, well, you know, Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry for leaving you out of the loop. And Baker says to him, John, that was the biggest favor you could ever do for me.
Next question. This one's from Thomas. As an admirer of Baker and as an NGO executive and humanitarian that worked in South Africa and the Middle East, would you speak to his ability to put concern for suffering people high on his agenda after he was out of active politics? He's thinking more primarily of his ability to hold senior leaders in Israel, Palestine, and South Africa because of his reputation to account, to get them to be more socially oriented before and after his effect on government life.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. I mean, Baker is certainly not a standard issue Republican. For example, he's very active on climate change right now. He's been working with other Republicans on a carbon tax proposal. So, he's very much a committed conservationist and has done a lot of work in Africa on that issue. He's an outdoorsman. He's a hunter as well, but primarily I would say sort of an outdoorsman, an environmentalist in the mode of George Herbert Walker Bush himself. But I will say that as a diplomat and when he was in office, Baker was absolutely unsentimental view of the world. And he did not make human rights or values a core part of his diplomacy, and his view of foreign affairs does not include that. He is somebody who absolutely is a huge believer in international alliances and working with partners around the world. And that was, I think, the key in many ways to his Cold War diplomacy. But he very, very wary, a deep and intuitive, almost a visceral dislike of the militarization of American foreign policy and the idea of American adventurism, as he would see it, around the world. So, he would not be somebody who would be threatening military action because of a human rights violation, for example. So they were strongly worded, both he and Bush, when it came to things like Tiananmen Square or Soviet crackdowns in some of the Baltic states that were struggling for their independence. But they really didn't shift American policy to match that rhetoric with their words in many ways.
Yeah, I think on Israel-Palestine, just as an example, he's so far, this is how far the Republican Party has come. He was not a pro-Israel, do or die, won't question them no matter what kind of Republican. That's today's Republican Party. Back then, he was quite critical of Israel. It wasn't because I think he had a human rights feeling for the Palestinians per se. He just thought that the Israeli settlements were unconstructive, that they made it harder to come to a deal. It was a very unsentimental view of it, right? Settlements were an obstacle to coming to peace. I don't think he was necessarily offended per se by them as a moral issue. I just think he saw it as a practical thing, as a waste of time and a waste of an opportunity to come together.
I'm going to ask another question of my own, if you people don't mind, and because it was mentioned about his capability, his deal making was brought up, and that was his role following the invasion of Kuwait, and how he was able to bring such a large coalition together to re-invade Kuwait and kick out Iraq. Can you kind of go over his role in that?
Well, I have to say, first of all, this is the first war in American history that almost turned a profit as a result of Baker's coalition building skills. So clearly he was very good, and he really got on, he called it his tin cup tour, and, hopped on an airplane and basically never got off. Although interestingly, it really was Bush himself more so than Baker, I think, who was determined to, this aggression shall not stand, right? You remember that phrase of Bush's, and he was leading rather than following his advisors when it came to the issue of, really wanting to have a forceful military response. What Baker brought, as you said, was the coalition building skills, including, remarkably, bringing the Soviets along in this. And Baker's advisors at the State Department saw the opportunity here. And in fact, they actually wrote a memo to him, and they said, this is the first test of the post-Cold War era. And Baker saw Saddam's invasion very much in that light. And he was very close working partners at this point with the Soviet foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze. And the two of them actually flew together and gave a joint statement about the initial invasion, which was really unprecedented. For 40 years, you had a situation where the world had been divided into two camps. And either you were with us or you were against us. And that held for basically every major foreign policy issue up until that moment of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, in which you actually had the world's two nuclear superpowers standing together and saying, in this new world that we envision, violations of international sovereignty and international law like this will not be agreed upon. So it really was a remarkable moment that Baker sees in the context of his Soviet diplomacy, as well as just his natural kind of diplomatic and deal-making skills.
Our next question comes from William. He writes, "You were so correct about JAB3. I had the honor of working with him under at U.S. Treasury during Reagan's second term. He was revered by all at Treasury and was the consummate pro. Where and how in his family or personal background did he get his strength, stamina, and devotion to process?"
That's a great question. It's really interesting. You know, it's his staff would call him, you know, like the sort of the marathon man. I mean, he could just go early morning, late night. He seemed to be endlessly energetic. I think he came from a family in Houston that had basically been a family of winners, a family of succeeders. They had built modern Houston in some ways. And the legacy of that for Jim Bakker, who turned out to be the fourth Jim Bakker, even though he's the third. We spent 7 years working on this book. I still don't understand why he's the fourth man named James Addison Bakker, but his name is James Addison Bakker.
They don't have a good explanation.
No, they really don't.
We even mentioned that to Bakker, I must say, in a recent event about this book. He still didn't offer any further clarification.
But I do think that family history, the family, you know, the expectation that you were going to succeed, that you were going to, you know, you were going to be a major force in your community, you know, was a driving factor in his life. And I think that he translated that into politics in a way his father and grandfather and great-grandfather didn't. But I think that, you know, he respected process, he respected institutions, maybe some of the lawyer background helped in that regard. As Susan said, he didn't have a background in economics. He didn't have a background in international affairs. What he had a background in was success. And I think success breeds success. Once you're seen as a winner, that aura comes with you. And he also was good about staff. I think he picked a good staff. He brought them with him. He wasn't afraid to have people who were smarter than him, and they challenged him at times. He didn't always necessarily get along with the career staff, who sometimes resented these political people who followed him from place to place. But eventually, I think they, like a State Department, for instance, you would see in the histories, all these ambassadors who say, well, you know, he didn't really use us. But in the end, I think they appreciated that under him, that was the place where the action happened. You know, that the State Department, when Bakker was in charge of the State Department, was the center of the action. That's not always the case.
Right. The next question, let's see here. Tell us something that really, this question comes from Carol. Please tell us something that really surprised you in your research, the writing of the book.
Well, that's a great question. I like a lot of people, I love biographies, but I'm usually like the first part of biography is better. You pick up a book and you know at least something about the dazzling resume of a Jim Bakker or a, president when you decide to read a book like that. But I didn't know anything about Bakker's background and what led him into politics. And I was surprised by what I found, because first of all, there really is this incredible kind of family tragedy and accident of history that it's not just that he meets George Bush, right? It's not like the preppy kind of country club cocktail party friendship that I thought perhaps it was, but really a deep bond. And the sort of most moving thing that we found was that when Bakker's first wife, Mary Stewart, he had fallen in love with her when they were still in college. They met on the beach in Bermuda. She was diagnosed with cancer at a very early age. She was still in her 30s. They had 4 young sons at this time. Bakker was living this very conventional life. I mean, a life of great privilege, but also really a very constrained life, of duty and obligation. His wife gets this terrible diagnosis. And there's this letter that is in our book that's really never been published before, in which he confides this awful fact to George Herbert Walker Bush. And he says, I haven't told Mary Stewart herself, which, by the way, tells you a lot about 1969 and how the world has changed. I haven't told my wife. I haven't told my mother. I haven't told our children, but I'm telling you, George. Look, that's a secret. That's a bond like no other that you can imagine people carrying into public life all those decades later. So that was really eye-popping for me in a way that I did not expect. And it tells you a lot about the man, that he entered politics almost as a rebellion to the family, as opposed to the natural progression. You might think that, well, he's a privileged son of Texas and this was just, his family connections or something, but actually it was quite the opposite. And it really was his final act of assertion of independence against a very controlling father, I must say. When he told us that he and his friends called his father the warden, you know, and I said, okay, now I understand. Now I understand a little bit better.
Wasn't there also a really touching letter that you have in the book from his first wife to him?
Right, because in fact,
can you expand on that a little bit?
Exactly right. You know, that's the next part of the story. Because although he didn't tell Mary Stuart, of course, knew, right? He didn't want to ruin her last few months of life by, you know, confronting directly the fact that everybody knew she was going to die, but she knew. And she wrote him a letter, and she left it hidden in the dresser in their home. And when she passed away, she had told her friend, Susan Winston, to find the letter and give it to Jimmy, she called him. And Jim Baker gave us this letter, and it's in the book. I don't think that's ever been published before. And it's this heartbreaking letter in which she, you know, expresses her love for him, basically left from the grave, you know, behind. She says, "You were the love of my life. I wish I could be there to see you and the 4 boys as they grew up, but you've meant everything to me," and so forth. And even when we interviewed him about this in his late 80s, he still teared up, you know, almost a half century later. But the woman who helped him find the letter ended up becoming his second wife. So in the end, the story has some twists and turns to it.
Yeah, it was a great part of the book. It was really touching. Next question. Did he ever consider running for? I mean, we know he thought about it. I believe he ran for Attorney General in the state of Texas. But did he ever consider running for office other than that at that time? President, anything?
You know, the answer is yes. He did consider running for president in 1996 after, Bush had lost for the second term. But the truth is that he really wasn't likely to have much chance for success. And we had this sort of very interesting moment. We were visiting Baker and his wife, Susan, at their home in Texas. And we asked him about that. Why didn't you run in 1996? He had great approval ratings. He was pretty well known. He could have raised a lot of money. He was very well respected, certainly by the party's leadership. But so he's saying all this. He's saying, well, I was exhausted after all these years in Washington. And his wife, Susan, was fantastic. She just sort of like let the air out of the balloon. And she said, listen, honey, the party had left you. I mean, you weren't really the right candidate for that moment in time. They saw you as much too liberal. Now, he wasn't actually liberal in a sort of ideological sense, but this was the Gingrich era of maximum confrontation, and Jim Baker didn't play that kind of politics. He was seen as an establishment Republican, a country club Republican, a product of a kindler and less confrontational moment. So she gave the right answer, one, which is the reason that he didn't run.
Let's see, I already asked that one. This is a more maybe a Michigan-centric question. How would you compare Baker's impact on post-World War II, for example, to Arthur Vandenberg?
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, Vandenberg was super important, right? Because obviously his pivot from isolationism to internationalism presages the whole party's movement. I mean, I think you can certainly make the case that Vandenberg is a pivotal figure in the post-war era that leads to Eisenhower in some ways, right, as opposed to Taft. And without that, you wouldn't have the bipartisan consensus that more or less governed through the 40 years of the Cold War. So I wouldn't in any way take anything away from Vandenberg by saying that we think Baker was a singularly important figure in the post-Cold War era. I think Vandenberg, I've got his biography sitting on my nightstand, as a matter of fact, was truly on the list of top 10, American figures who was, other than being president, probably pretty central to the post-war era.
Well, what I would say is that, if Vandenberg was the party's World War II to post-World War II pivot, right, from the pre-war America firsters and isolationists to the post-war internationalists who built, kind of this modern order, Jim Baker was essentially the character of the next great political pivot. And he is a product of the transformation of the Republican Party into what it is today, and a Southern-based Republican Party where, there was a whole new kind of coalition that governed. It was the death of the old line Eastern establishment Republican Party, which literally does not exist today. And how many Republican members of Congress are there from the New England states that created the modern Republican Party, right? There's none, literally none. And Baker, grew up his whole life as a Southern Democrat, not a very active one, but, a Southern Democrat, and yet was sort of this new wave Republican Party. So in a way, you could sort of see him as a successor to that previous era of shift in politics that Vandenberg represented.
Next question. Baker did not want to return to the Bush campaign in 92, but he did. If he had been able to get Nick Brady and Dick Darman out as part of the bust September Detroit Econ Club speech, could Bush have found a path to victory over Clinton?
It's a great question. Is it possible? Yes. I think that, but I don't think that necessarily would have changed the overall arc of that election at that point. Baker, Bush in the end wins just 38% of the vote. I think people at that point had soured on him, and a little like Churchill after World War II. A person who obviously has great success on the foreign affairs stage, and then fails to convince people that he knows what he's doing on the domestic stage. Baker was resistant to coming back. You're absolutely right. He literally cried the day he left the State Department. He tried to get out of it by talking about faking a Middle East peace mission at the end in order to stay at state. In the end, he obviously couldn't do that. He knew he had to come back to help his friend Bush, and he resisted as long as he could. And when he did come back, he was sort of half-hearted about it. I mean, his own staff would go to him and say, "What are you doing? Why aren't you more involved?" And he would say, "I am. What are you talking about?" They went to his wife and they said, "You got to get him more engaged." But it may have been just too late. I mean, the truth is, if Baker had come in earlier in the year, if he'd come in in, say, February or March, when some people were agitating for him to come, and he'd come more full-hearted, maybe he could have turned it around. No question, everybody in the Bush White House was relieved when he showed up, because they did see in him, again, that aura of a winner, and thought he could make a difference. And he did tighten up the ship pretty quickly. The odds were already pretty long at that point, and clearly it was so long that he didn't make that difference.
So this next question also comes from Christy, and it ties into the last one. How did the Bush-Baker relationship change over the years?
I think that was one of the more interesting sort of questions we set out with in the book. And we were very interested to find that it really evolved and shifted over time. Baker described to us that he was almost dazzled by George Herbert Walker Bush when he first met him. And it's hard for us all to sort of let go of the image we have of him later in life. But Bush was a pretty dazzling figure at this early stage, right? He had been a hero, a World War II hero, the youngest naval aviator. Baker was too young to serve in that war. He served in the Marines during the Korean War era, but he did not serve in the war, right? So, Bush has this sort of war hero thing. His father is Prescott Bush, who's a senator from Connecticut, but Bush has gone off and broken away from the family in a way that Baker did not have yet, the sort of moxie to do, right? Bush has left Connecticut behind and come to Texas to seek his fortune. And so Baker looked up to him as kind of an elder brother, especially he then gets into politics. He wins a seat in Congress. He's immediately pegged as an up and comer. And I think that really impressed Baker initially, although they both allow that they were super competitive on the tennis court, but Baker might have been the better player. And actually had been the two-time club champion at singles when he was teamed up with Bush as a doubles partner. So they both brought advantages to the relationship, but that did change, especially when they're at the height of national politics and Baker becomes Reagan's chief of staff and Bush is his vice president. And I think Baker realizes then, wow, I don't have the fancy title, but there's no question that I have more power day to day. And I'm the one essentially running the government right now. And I think that was a major shift in the Reagan years, in the sort of balance of power between the two. And of course, another key moment of real tension was that 92 campaign that Peter just talked about. And, especially Barbara Bush, there was some real sourness and real hard feelings after that. Had Baker really done enough to do what he could to pull Bush out of this disastrous, and embarrassing loss in 92. But, it tells you everything you need to know that it was Jim Baker there, literally rubbing George Bush's feet when he died, and weeping at his funeral.
While I'm looking for the next question, where there is a request to see your dog.
Sorry, Ellie is a little bit. Oh, she's here. Yeah, come here. Come here.
She heard.
Sorry, we're sorry about that. Yeah. She is very beautiful, we think. And she also just had a cameo on the Showtime show, The Circus, which I don't know if any of you watch it, but it's kind of a good documentary style take on this presidential campaign. And they showed up last week in our backyard to film us. And somehow I think Ellie was on camera longer than Peter was.
She's better.
The next question is, this is from Ray. What intrigued you about James Baker III to even start the writing process, to even write the book?
I think we started back in 2013, and it was even before Trump came along, and we were talking a lot about what was broken in Washington. And Baker was such a exemplar of how Washington could work when things, were different. And I think we wanted to kind of explore that a little bit. We were surprised that nobody had even written a biography of James Baker. A lot of secretaries of state have had biographies written about them. They haven't done very much. Here's this guy who'd been Secretary of State when the world changed and nobody had written about him. And I think the last thing we were talking about this and we were discussing it, and I was in a cab in Cleveland one day, and the driver and I were talking about how screwed up things were in Washington. He said, yeah, if only we had a Jim Baker there right now. And I was really struck that a cab driver in Cleveland would remember Jim Baker as an example of how things could be. And I thought, well, if that's the case, then we ought to look at a guy like this. And he wanted to cooperate. That made for a better book. He opened his archives to us unfettered. He gave us all the hours of interviews we could want. We interviewed all 8 of his children. We interviewed his 107-year-old nanny. She's still around, 107. So we really enjoyed, I think, having open access to such an interesting life.
How many interviews in total across the board? I think was it 200, more than 200 interviews?
200, 215, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's an amazing amount of interviews.
Yeah.
And where did you do most of your of the research at? Was that the presidential libraries? Was that other facilities? Just curious.
We had some from your library, which is great. We had some help, really terrific help there. And we did some, obviously, Reagan and Bush. But the primary places were the Princeton archives, where Baker has put his Secretary of State, most of all his papers there, and also some at Rice University, which is,
the Baker Institute
down there. And then he also gave us some boxes of papers that frankly weren't in either one. So we were really lucky to have a real paper trail of his life.
There's a question here about the letter that you had mentioned about from George Bush, from Baker to George Bush about his wife's condition. Is it currently available in the Bush archives? And was Secretary Baker at all reluctant to share it with you?
I don't believe it is available in any archives. He shared it with us when we talked to him about it. And I think, I don't think he was really reluctant. I think he understood that, if you're going to understand his life, you had to understand this chapter in it. And even though he's not an introspective guy, even though he's not a motive type of person, I think he understood that was important to understand his life.
Yeah, no, he understood that, he even now he's turned 90 and, he is a very savvy figure. And I think he understood that to really be a figure in history, it's not enough to have written 2 memoirs of your own. And he has written 2 memoirs of his own. But he understands that you need an independent work by, respected independent people. And I think he understood very clearly what he was doing. That was the biggest surprise. Somebody asked that earlier. That was the biggest surprise for me. Jim Baker was known and is, in fact, a very canny steward of his own reputation, very adept at, spinning and manipulating the press. And he never did that with us. And I really was, a little surprised.
And we didn't know it.
Exactly. Or he's done such a good job that we didn't know.
They were brainwashed.
But no, he answered all of our questions, and especially for a gentleman of the old school, which he very much is. He wasn't introspective, but he managed to be very open about, I think, difficult subjects that you might not have expected, you know, an 88-year-old to be willing to talk to you about.
He didn't try to put anything off on us. He didn't try to rule anything out. And he wasn't really defensive about anything. They talked about their own family troubles, of which there were quite a few, in a very open and candid way, I thought.
He's more defensive about the fights of the Reagan White House in some ways than he is about what happened in his family.
Because you have so many hours of interviews with the secretary. This next question comes again from another Ford trustee, but I'm going to expand on the question a little bit. The question is did he have any regrets not running for national office? And I'm going to add in, did he have any regrets at all about anything that he did or did not do while serving his country?
I think
not a man of regrets.
No,
he's not a man of regrets.
I think he regrets not being president, but I don't think he regrets not running for president, right? I think he would have enjoyed being president because he's good at it.
But he's self-aware enough to know. That's the thing. He's a realist about himself as well as others. He wasn't good as a candidate. You know, we talked to someone who covered his 1978 Texas Attorney General race. You know, he would go to state fairs in Texas, and whatever the opposite of kissing babies was, is what he did. He would walk right past the people. He wasn't asking for their vote. George W. Bush, Peter had an interview with President Bush, and who also was running that same year, who loves Jim Baker, and who said, like, listen, the guy really was not a good candidate. Okay. So I think Jim Baker understood that, you know, electoral politics wasn't for him. You know what he regretted? He regretted that Bush did not win a second term and that he couldn't go back to be the Secretary of State, and he didn't get his shot at that big, all-encompassing Middle East peace deal, which of course eludes us to this day. That was a big regret for him.
You mentioned Bush 43, and there is a question that came in about, and a lot of people don't know this, and this is, I'm really happy you included this in your book, is about Jim Baker's role following the 2000 election in Florida. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it feels a little relevant today if we are looking at a potential contest after the current election. Look, when George W. Bush ran for office, he didn't want to be seen as his daddy's guy. So he didn't have people like Jim Baker involved in the campaign, kept an arm's distance away. But when the election day came and suddenly it all came down to a few hundred votes in Florida, the first person he got on the phone with to say, hey, come help, was Jim Baker. And again, because Baker had that aura of confidence and an aura of a winner, the Democrats told us that they knew the minute he was picked, they were toast. They were going to be in real trouble because Baker just, you know, was more suited to that role than, for instance, Warren Christopher, who was a very respected former Secretary of State on the Democratic side, but not a knife fighter, not a political guy in the way that Baker was. And they show up for this meeting. Baker sits down with Christopher. Christopher thinks they're going to arrange this, two wise men, elder statesmen. They're going to figure out this problem in Florida together. Baker's like, no, I'm not here to negotiate. My guy won. I'm here to preserve his victory. And he did. And they had a tough fought campaign all the way through the Supreme Court. And there are a lot of people to this day who are disappointed. You know, I think compared to what we see today, Baker and particularly Gore and Bush all had a respect for the system and didn't try to then delegitimize it or question the credibility of American elections the way we're seeing today.
This will be the last question, and it comes from Marge. And of course, when you read the book, one of the themes that I saw in the book is, of course, a lot of outdoorsmanship, a lot of hunting. You talk about his trip with his father, his trip to Africa, the safari, and of course, throughout his entire life, the hunting, the outdoorsmanship. And so this question from Marge, what does Jim Baker do in retirement? Does he enjoy his downtime?
Well, that is a good question. So this is amazing. He's 90. I mentioned he turned 90 earlier this year during the height of the lockdown this spring. And he and his wife, Susan, actually contracted the coronavirus early, by the end of the summer. Luckily, they're okay. This man is made of really strong stuff. And the week that our book came out, he was actually off elk hunting in Wyoming with his son and grandson. So the answer is yes. This is what he probably loves most in life. He really is. I think Peter and I found him to be just a natural outdoorsman, and that's where he really is at his happiest. is doing that. And he's definitely done that. Although, you know, he still maintains an office at Baker Botts, the firm that his grandfather, great grandfather were essentially the founders of, which at one time was the largest law firm west of the Mississippi. Now, I guess nobody really goes into the office anymore, but you know, he still is working at least to a certain extent today. It's really, he's a very, very, I think there's something about being Secretary of State. The people who make it to those jobs have incredible constitutions. You know, look at Madeleine Albright, look at George Shultz. They're both still going strong.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much. This was fantastic. I congratulate you on your success as journalists. I really applaud you for your body of work over these years. America, I'm sure, appreciates that work. And the book, I can say, is absolutely fantastic. You know, it's a really a great read. And I believe if you're interested in it, you can go into our chat bar and find the location where you can purchase the book. Of course, we're the library museum is still closed at this time. We hope to be open in the very near future, but we still don't expect, of course, to have book talks with actually sales and people queuing up in lines and that type of thing for who knows when. We hope it's soon. We do not know. But again, thank you both for this wonderful talk and going over the history of a truly remarkable American.
Thank you so much.
Thank
this
you,
is
Joel.
Wonderful, and wonderful questions from your audience.
Thank
too.
you to the audience for chipping in.
Yeah.
That's a norm for us.
Yeah, that's great. You set a high standard.
Thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Good
To our
night.
patrons, thank you.